I'm really pleased today to introduce Bob Francois and John Horn, our experts who are going to be leading this hour-long conversation. Bob Francois is our Skandalaris expert on call right now, and he has a very long, illustrious career in executive leadership, much of which was at Koch Industries. We also have John Horn, who's a professor of practice and economics at the Olin School of Business, also a long career in management and strategy consulting. And I know they have a lot to share with us this morning. So.
Nicole, thank you so much. John and I had the opportunity to talk a couple of weeks back about the subject, and as Mike Sieper and Nicole had invited us to participate, and it was startling to me, with both the academic and the industry side of things in very quick alignment. Today, I think what we'd like to do is John and I will just trade off in the conversation, and we'd like to share things foundational to negotiation. So not getting into economic analysis and legal documents and contract terms and conditions and all the things that scare people. And for me, just to kick it off, and I want to hand off to John because he had some great observations when we were talking in this area, is negotiation is something that each of us does every day of our lives. And it's really about conversations, and that's the key word in all of this. The opportunity to negotiate, in a sense, with friends, with family, with peers, sports teams, if you participate in sports, clubs, even your professors. It's there every single day. You have two things to think about as you do that. One of them is you generally have incredible knowledge about the counterparty, the other party in those negotiations. You know your brothers and sisters, you know your parents, you know relatives. You really get to know your team, whether it's a project team or a sports team or in the arts, very, very quickly. And you know a lot more intimate details about their lives, what's important to them, than you will often when you start a conversation as you launch your careers. And it shouldn't scare you. What we're going to talk about today are some strategies, some things that can help you to really feel comfortable in those really important conversations. The second thing for me, before I hand to John, is it's really something to be self-aware for all of us. And throughout my career, I found myself at times violating the rules and really having to step back and with a dose of humility to start over in some respects in a conversation or a negotiation. It really is no big deal if you're working with the right counterparty, but we all bring bias to those conversations. And there are different kinds of biases. Sometimes it's what's called confirmatory bias. You think you know the answers, you think you know what's good, and you want to just, your conversation is steering towards confirming what you think the answer is. Staying wide open, intellectually honest, and really transparent is important in any of those conversations to learn. The second area is immediacy bias. The things that happen to us most recently tend to color our thinking sometimes and our approaches to things. And setting that aside is really important to have a good negotiation. And lastly, what really stifles conversation or stalls negotiations, and I had seen that many times over the 40 years I worked with teams that worked for me, teams that I was a part of, and that is anchoring. When you dig in and you feel like this is what I've got to have, it won't work otherwise, sometimes you miss opportunities to really think through a way to align incentives so that both sides of the negotiation feel good about the outcome. So doing your best to set those biases aside, really getting to know the counterparties and really understand from their point of view what's important are the things we'll work through today in the conversation. John, you had some great observations about how it's something we do every day. What's on your mind there?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I building on that, I would 100% agree with this idea that you have to understand the other side's point of view. In general, if you want to be better at strategy, and a negotiation is a strategic exercise, you're interacting with someone else to try to accomplish a joint goal, but also accomplish a goal for yourself. If you don't understand the other side, you're never going to be able to be as successful as you could be if you understood that other side's point of view and their position. And what that leads to is this: there are two effective ways of thinking about a negotiation. One is a transactional negotiation, which means I'm negotiating over, say, buying a piece of art from you, and I'm never going to talk to you again. I will never buy another piece from you. I will never be at the same art show as you. I will never go to your website again. It's just that's the one time we interact. That's transactional. The other is relationship. And this would be where we're going to negotiate over multiple things over the course of time. And it's going to be more effective if we have a good relationship and we give and take over the course of that relationship than if we have always negotiating over each individual item as if it's the one-off thing we're talking about. And to Bob's point about this is what we do every day, is if we think about our everyday life, when we walk into a store and we want to buy something, we think of that relationship as more transactional, unless it's a store we go to multiple times a week. Or if it's our friends or our family or our teachers or our teammates or whatever. When we have those relationships, we think about how we bargain or negotiate or come to agreements with those other people much differently than if it's I've never met this person and I will probably never meet them again. So this idea of when you're going into a negotiation for a business deal or for a business interaction, think of it as, is this kind of a relationship I want to build over time, or is this a one-off deal where I'm never going to interact with this person again? And what I would encourage you to do is to think of the former, that these are relationships you're trying to build. And how can I think about this as not just I'm responding to someone who is asking for a proposal, but this first proposal in a string of proposals I will be doing with this company or with this person over the course of time. And when you start to think about this as a relationship, it leads naturally to, well, I have to understand this person I'm in a relationship with. Because again, that's what we do every day in our lives. So framing this business negotiation in terms of this is a longer relationship, a longer interaction I want to have, will then naturally lead to the types of sort of tactics of, okay, well, I'm willing to accept a lower price today if that means I'm probably going to get the first chance to bid in the next 3 years on subsequent work. Or if I get this first project, that means I'll probably get all the follow-on work because I did the first part. So when you start thinking about it as a set or a relationship over time with any of your clients, it's going to change how you approach the negotiation, and you won't be as stuck on, I have to get $1,000 because my rent's coming due, and if I don't get $1,000, I'm not going to be able to make rent this week. It's or this month. It's how can maybe I can accept 900, and I could go to my landlord and say, look, I'm probably going to get another couple deals. If I pay you 900, I'll give you 300 next month, etc. So it's always about relationships and over time and thinking about conversation as opposed to I need $1,000. They're asking for $500. How do I get them closer to $1,000 in this particular one interaction?
That's a great point, John. And just so that we don't underemphasize the importance of and the challenge of really getting to know your counterparty. And to John's point, the relationship side of negotiating is funny in the way it strikes back over time. There's people you'll meet that you're going to do work with, you'll collaborate, and you never know when their talents, their knowledge, their capability will come in handy. And so really understanding what makes them tick and what gets them up every day, excited about what they do, what are their skills, knowledge, capability, what's their value system, and how does it compare to yours, is really challenging. But I'll tell you what, you got to go back to ancient history to figure out there was one guy that kind of had it right, and a way to do that, and that's Socrates. And those of you that have taken any courses in philosophy of that know the Socratic method is one that's filled with questions. And we used in our businesses a lot of times just a rule of thumb, if you will, that we called it the 90-10 rule. 90% listening, 10% talking in a negotiation. Hard to do, but that really allows you to understand the person on the other side of the table, what's important to them, what makes a difference that matters, asking questions, talking only for clarification, confirmation, or adjustment to what each side is saying is really important and constructive. It sets a positive tone for the conversations. It shows real interest, and people can detect that very quickly. And it really sets you up for building a foundation that you can use throughout your careers and over many projects, as John said, not just the one that you happen to be starting to talk about at that point. The other is building knowledge. We'll talk more about that later. And really understanding the scope, the needs and wants, the timeframes, all those tactical, if you will, details is important, but it's really understanding what makes that person on the other side of the table tick. And there's one question that we used it all the time, and we tease each other sometimes and joke about it in businesses, but there's a single word that can help you get to an incredible level of depth in those conversations. And the word is why. When someone says something, they have their own filter systems. We all do. And what they say and how they say it, you're going to hear it maybe differently than they intended to communicate that point. And so using the question why and respectfully digging for a bit more depth, knowing when to dig, when to back off is really important, but it's essential to getting to know the other side. John, what would you add?
Yes, I would agree with everything there. I would the two things I would add are that put yourself in a similar situation. Do you like to be talked at, or do you like to have a conversation? Do you like to be asked questions? When you're interacting with someone else, as human beings, we normally don't like to be talked at. And so when you're in a negotiation, if you're talking at the other side, they're probably not going to be in a position where they feel like it's a good conversation or a comfortable conversation or a relaxing or an enlightening conversation. They're going to feel a little defensive because they feel like they're being talked at. And so if you are thinking about extracting more information and asking questions, it's going to put them more at ease, because again, that's how we naturally have conversations as human beings, and what we like is to not be talked at. The second thing it does is when you're asking questions, it shows that you're collaborative. And I would venture that most of the types of business opportunities you will be pursuing are ones where you're going to have some kind of collaborative interaction, either with the client or with other people in your network to serve the client. And if you come in and say, here's my answer, here's what I can do, here are my skills, here's what I can provide, here are my past projects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you're going to come across as someone who's not very willing to listen and to be a partner. And especially for things that are creative, the client is going to want to feel like they have some input, that it's not going to be 3 months down the road and you come and present something which is not at all aligned with what they want, and they feel like they'll have wasted money. So the mere act of asking questions and being inquisitive in the negotiation itself also conveys a message to the other side about the values that you bring, which is, I will behave this way when we're actually doing the project. And that also will help you in terms of being seen as a more viable candidate. The other thing I would say about the asking the why is I completely agree, but I would actually expand it a little to all the W questions: who, what, where, when, why, how. Because all of those questions can be really valuable. I think of them as open the mind questions. So you either have open the mind questions where you're exploring, or close the debate where you're narrowing down to a specific answer. And all those who, what, where, when, why, how questions are things which open and start to explore. They're not yes, no types of questions. So like, why are you deciding to do this project? Is a great question to ask. Or why is it that you are focused on 3 months? Oh, because you have a big, you have a big planned event in 3 months. Okay, I get why it has to happen in 3 months. But you could do the same thing for who. Like, who are you thinking of partnering with? Who are the artists that inspire you, or who are the competitors who've done things really creatively that you think you wish you had done? How often do you plan on using this, or how are you thinking about using this throughout your organization? Those big questions get people to start talking, and if you're listening, then you can start to figure out where they get excited and what they keep focusing on. So in conjunction with asking those big open the mind questions, you have to be actively listening. And as I tell my kids all the time, hearing and listening are two different things. Hearing means that the sound waves are going into your ear and your brain is processing them. Listening is actually taking those sound signals and processing them into continuing the conversation, and reacting to what you are hearing. So you need to be an active listener and take in what the other side says and process that and use that to continue the conversation. Again, back to this idea of building a relationship with the other side.
Absolutely, John. And you said a couple of things in there. I'd like to just throw out something that may be a little controversial to some folks. And the context is in negotiating, it's in business, it's in figuring out how to get something done that's really important. You'll hear people talk in different terms around the subject of consensus, or in our company, we talk about alignment of incentives. And I would argue, and not everyone agrees, but that alignment of incentives is much more valuable, much more sustainable, and it allows you to build on that business relationship. I'd like to read something that's a quote from Margaret Thatcher around the subject of consensus. And a colleague and friend a few years ago, just not long before I retired, had shared this with me. I wish I had it 30 years before then, but it really kind of brings home the difference. And in negotiating, if what you're trying to do, as John described, and I tried to describe, around building relationships that are sustainable, long-term, that you can call on from time to time when you need it, that aligning incentives, that really understanding at a good level of depth is important. So what Margaret had to say about consensus was, consensus is the process of abandoning all beliefs, principles, values, and policies in search of something in which no one believes, but to which no one objects. The process of avoiding the very issues that have to be solved merely because you cannot get agreement on the way ahead. Think about what causes would have been fought and won under the banner, "I stand for consensus." And that's from Margaret Thatcher. And when you think about that, everybody giving things up until you get to a point where you say, okay, fine, let's go ahead, that's not negotiation. It's really, as John described, asking those questions for depth. It's really getting to know the other party. It's really understanding what's important to them and why it's important to them, and figuring out options and alternatives that you can share and that they can share to reach an agreement that makes sense for both counterparties, both sides in the argument. You know, there's one thing that I think, as students, and once you graduate and move into the work world, whether you start your own business, you go to work for an agency or a marketing company or other folks that really get you a good start, you bring amazing value to your clients from the very first day that you step out of the academic world into the business world. And don't underestimate that. You may not have the years of experience and the skills developed and the opportunity to try and fail at things and to learn from that and to grow, but you do bring unique points of view and perspectives. You bring diversity into the workplace. You bring alternative ways of thinking that haven't been clouded by years and years of doing the same role or the same kind of a role. And it is a risk. The longer, I think the longer we're at things sometimes in business, the more we narrow our point of view or our perspective. And what I mean by that is, if you take someone that works in a manufacturing plant and leading an operation, and it's that same operation for 20 years, they really get to know it inside and out. They know every detail of the operation. They know what good looks like, what problems look like as they're developing. And we start to shortcut. We start to say, I've got so much expertise, I know what needs to be done when an opportunity or a problem comes up. And that's something that you're not bringing with you. You're coming in with a totally blank sheet of paper, a fresh perspective, different ways of thinking. A lot of your professors, if you've done internships, companies you've worked for in the internships, have helped to begin shaping you as a professional. And so don't ever underestimate that. Companies, smart companies, want you to challenge their thinking. They want you to really question their approaches. They want you to bring freshness and new ideas. And as part of a negotiation, As you ask those questions, as you probe and dig deeper, you really can develop a relationship that is open, that's transparent, and that challenges the thinking of your client, your customer, any way you want to talk about it. John, what would you say about the value that students bring as they just leave academia and get into the work world?
I would agree 100% with what you said. The last almost 20 years now, I've spent helping companies understand their competitors and how their competitors are going to react and move and behave in the business world. And one of the key insights that I've taken away just from my own observation is the idea that Bob was talking about. As you gain more experience, you fall into patterns, partly because it's habit and partly because it's comfortable, but partly because that's what got me to where I was, where I am today. Is I've grown up as someone who's managed a manufacturing floor. That's why I've continued to be promoted. I'm not going to switch now and go try to create brands and be a marketing person, or I'm not going to start to do financial analysis. I'm an operations and a manufacturing person. And as companies and clients and people that are more senior in organizations, they narrow down their scope of how to look at problems, partly based on just unconscious sort of narrowing of how they view the world, but partly there's a little bit of I don't want to rock the boat and try to go experiment with something new because I might fail, and if so, there goes my job. So I would say, again, in light of this collaboration message, is it's not that your role is to come in and say, here's how you should do things differently and here's what you're missing. But in that spirit of collaboration, offering new ways of looking at the world, but then also being willing to look in and listen and integrate what you're hearing from your clients, because that will also help round you out. I was, in my consulting days at a big consulting firm, I was not someone who focused on a particular industry. And I was always told that, clients were very reluctant about bringing me in because I didn't know their industry. But the value that I was able to provide was I had examples from dozens of different industries. And by asking the client what their problem was and what they were being challenged with, it opened up analogies to, well, I've seen this work in another industry this way. And the initial reaction was usually, well, that can't work here. And then I would fall back on Bob's question of why. And they would say, because it's never been done. I'd say, okay, well, just because it hasn't been done means it can't be. Let's think about why it can't be done, not why it hasn't been done. And usually that would lead to, well, okay, maybe 75% of it we can do. This other 25% doesn't really apply, but that's 75% of stuff that we hadn't thought about before. So being open, asking questions. Again, it comes back to this idea of problem solving. And as people who have creative backgrounds, I would encourage you to keep focusing on that element of the value you bring, not the I know what the answer is and I'm going to tell you what the answer should be.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, John. Remember what we said earlier, that one of the hardest things to do, and for me, it was always one of the most fun things to do, was to try to put yourself in the other party's shoes, really from their point of view, their perspective, their view of the world, their baggage. As John said, whether it's we can't do that, either because we tried it before and it didn't work, or just listen carefully, ask those probing questions, as John said. One of the most important things in a negotiation and an ongoing relationship is what we would term seeking and sharing knowledge. And it matters every day. As you meet people, and to me, in any business relationships, talent is always the most important, the number one thing that as a leader, I tried to focus on. I felt like, and our company always felt like, it was extremely important. The values and beliefs that we all bring to what we do every day, it frames who we are. It frames our trustworthiness, how we're going to approach things. When you give your word, is it really something that others can count on? Skills and knowledge you learn and you'll develop, and those with a high degree of intellectual curiosity are going to continuously try to learn throughout their careers and their lives. As you meet people, though, get to know them, really get to know them at a level of depth. every interaction, every conversation is an opportunity to learn something and to think about how might I apply that as I try to put together a business proposal, a, a scope of work, an approach, limits on what I'm willing to do or capable of doing. It might even point you at where can I get some help? There's people I've met along the way that could really help with part of this project, and drawing on those resources really can set you apart and really continuously build the value you bring every day. Input, challenge, collaboration, partnership are highly valuable, and they're words you don't often hear unless you really do what John was describing earlier, which is collaborative negotiation. Everybody wants a win, so both sides, it's a win-win. That's thrown around all the time, and it just becomes an acronym, or it's words that don't have real substance behind them unless you do that hard work of really seeking and sharing the knowledge. Don't be afraid to share what you know as well. It's not giving things away from free. It's not holding things back, but to really, and it's not trying to impress people, but it's really to try to align incentives to get that. Yeah, I think I understand what you want. Let me play back some different options, some different ways of us maybe approaching that. And it's that give and take that really gets you to an agreement that's sustainable and that really builds your capability as you go. Challenge is a word that's used oftentimes in many contexts in business. Unfortunately, in many cases, it's not done well. It's not done the way it's intended. Our chairman and CEO, Charles Koch, would say that sometimes it doesn't feel very good because we all have pride in what we do. We all feel like that our ideas, the things that we take a lot of time to invest in, matter. And if you're challenging the ideas, the approaches, the options. You're not challenging the person. And unfortunately, sometimes it comes across that the person's being challenged. I think one of the things that helped so much, whether the negotiation was the sale of a business, buying a business, a dispute, a legal dispute that was headed to the courts if we didn't get it resolved, a new product development, a launch of a product, different routes to market, all of those different things you get into. I think the opportunity to get challenged, to really understand, allowed us to get to yes, to get to a point where we were in agreement that there was a sensible way to do that, a timely way, and an economic way. And it's highly valuable in helping you to meet or exceed client or counterparty expectations and to create real value in your relationships. I think, John, you had a point about keeping a journal and really building that knowledge base and not going from interaction to interaction. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, before I do, I want to come back quickly to this idea of incentives and alignment and consensus and yes, because I do want to touch on that and maybe give a slightly different way of framing it. When I hear that quote from Margaret Thatcher about consensus versus alignment, what it brings to mind to me is the idea of consensus really is about saying no to lots of little things, and the consensus is what we all agree yes to. And by nature, what that means is there's a lot of things we each bring to the table or to any negotiation or discussion that each of us wants. The negotiations where we all want the same thing aren't negotiations. We just do it. I mean, that's not even really a negotiation. It's like saying, hey, should we go get sushi in a movie? And everyone says yes. It's okay, well, there's no negotiating. I mean, we all just go do it. Negotiations occur when people have different interests or different things that they want. And consensus means we have to strip away and say no to all the things where there's disagreement until we agree on the things that everyone says in common. And so you're not having a big sort of a big area of a potential agreement. You're coming down to a narrow scope. Whereas an alignment of incentives is around, we're all sort of getting most of what we want, but we're framing it in a way that everyone is focused on how this agreement gets them what they want. And so that their incentives are aligned, saying, yes, I want to agree to do it the way we've agreed to do it because I get most of what I want. and you get most of what you want from your perspective, and the third person gets most of what they want from their perspective. So to me, consensus is about getting rid and saying no and eliminating things, whereas alignment of incentives is saying yes and building and keeping as much as possible in the pool of what we're going to do, and getting everyone to focus on the things that they most care about and not focus on the stuff that may not be as important to them. And what that leads me to the other element I wanted to raise up is this idea of yes. There's a book about negotiation called Getting to Yes. The yes is the we agree to the negotiation. And in line with this sort of having the conversation that Bob was talking about, there's a technique in improv comedy. There's essentially one rule of improv comedy, which is you always say yes and. You never say no but. And I think it's a great tool to use in terms of negotiation too, because once you start saying no, or I can't do that, or that's not possible, or that doesn't work, or that's not feasible, etc., but I could do this instead, you're telling the other person they're wrong. You're telling them that what they're saying is not valid. And if you say yes and, or as yes, that would be great if we did that, and if in exchange, if I could do that, have an extra 2 weeks to work on it, that'd be great. That again is we're aligning incentives because you get what you want and I get the time frame I want. So it's not consensus of we're going to narrow down to a smaller scope that gets done in the time frame that you want. It's we have the bigger scope of what you want, but at the time frame that I want. And so this idea of yes and building, as opposed to no but I'm going to cut down what you want, is I think is one way of thinking about that framing of the conversation. Always building as opposed to paring away and cutting down to a smaller kernel that is the final agreement. And a great way to, back to Bob's original question about journaling, a great way to understand how you're doing and how you can improve your negotiation is to keep track of what you've been doing. So as you go into every conversation, think about the 1 or 2, maybe 3 things you want to focus on in terms of how you're negotiating. Am I saying yes? Am I asking questions? Am I listening? What are the things you want to work on in that conversation besides just, did I get a deal? That's the transactional stuff. It's the relationship stuff. And then after the session is over, you should go back and you should write in your journal, how did you do on those things? What were some things that went well? What were some things that made you feel uncomfortable? This isn't a 3-hour exercise. It's like for 10 or 15 minutes, just write down a few notes. And after a couple of months, you will look back at your notes and start to see patterns of things you do really well and patterns of things you consistently struggle with. And that is a great way of helping you to refine what you're doing so that it's not just you always fall into the same traps. This idea of keeping track of what you've done and being deliberative about what you want to focus on when you go into each negotiation as far as how you want to build those relationships will help you be more focused on those types of engagements and activities. And so you will be improving over time.
Yeah, that's really well said, John. I think, at this point, guys, I mean, we've talked a little bit about it. It's something you do every day. It's using questions as a way to probe and to learn more is important. You really do, each of you will bring real value to those negotiations, the business relationships, the conversations. And then the whole subject of knowledge. There's a lot of different approaches, but building your knowledge base is critical. And at this point, doing that well with a client, you understand their wants and needs. You're starting to understand the deliverables and what you can do to make sure that you deliver with excellence. You're starting to frame up or write down, if you will, what's the proposal? What is it that you're willing to do to meet the client's needs and their expectations? And understand that challenge process, that really, asking questions, don't be afraid to go back, keep trying to build that out in a way that is really valuable because it'll set you up to exceed your client's expectations. And then starting to think a little bit about the economics. I think, as John and I talked a couple of weeks ago, we were in lockstep that unfortunately, a lot of times people get caught up on both sides of the negotiation on the subject of price, when in fact, price for me was always the last thing you really want to get into talking about. Once you've established all of the important elements of that agreement, the who is going to do what are the deliverables, what's the time frames, what are all of the important elements of that business relationship that you're establishing. And economics is a lot more than price. It's the opportunity cost. It's the fact that you have alternative uses of your resource. And if what you're signing up for is the most valuable use of that, it's good for you to understand or know, what am I giving up in order to be able to do this work for this client or take on this project? And is that more or less valuable, so that you're consciously making decisions around how you use your valuable resource? There's a next best alternative to what you're doing in any negotiation or conversation, both within the negotiation. So there's different options or alternatives. And we always talked about always take a free option, never give a free option. And that doesn't mean be a tough-minded negotiator. Both sides are going to look out for their own self-interest. You're going to do what's right for your own business, your company's business. The counterparty will do the same. But by understanding what's really important, you can frame it in a way that makes sense for both sides. You can think about opportunity cost from your point of view and your client's point of view. And you can think about the economics of how do you get paid? What is it that you're going to incur as far as costs, real out-of-pocket costs, and build that out a bit. So now you're starting to think about and understand what the value of taking on that project under those conditions that you've talked about would be. And if there are options and alternatives, I've always said in the businesses that I had the opportunity to lead, we always need to have a plan B, because not everything is going to go well. And it's not just a negotiation. Once you start work, you don't want that agreement to be a divorce decree. You want it to be something that if bumps are hit along the way, that both sides are saying, we got to figure this out. Let's get together and do the right thing the right way. And so it really requires a lot of humility, respect for the counterparty, trust, and integrity for yourself to really build your brand. Because every transaction you do, every negotiation, every deal that you strike is building your own personal brand, your company's brand, or it's tearing it down. And those, to me, in negotiating, if you bring a real sense of humility, you bring a real respect for the counterparty and what they're trying to accomplish. You trust that, yeah, they're going to work in their self-interest, but they want to find the best way to do this, and they want to see you be successful as well. And then to make sure that your integrity is never in question, especially when it gets difficult and there are problems and bumps in the road. So it's important to understand all of that. And it's okay sometimes to walk away from a negotiation. And John, maybe you could talk a little bit about at what point and do you walk away, and how do you do that in a way that doesn't leave a sour taste with everybody that was involved?
I think if you are focusing on building the relationship and asking questions and being collaborative in the negotiation process, it's much easier to walk away. If you are focusing on price and, from the beginning, if price is the only focus, it's, I would 100% agree with Bob that that's going to be challenging. Part of the reason it's challenging is when the client writes a proposal or puts out a proposal, there are a lot of assumptions that go behind that proposal, which they can't, even if they wanted to, couldn't detail out, and probably don't even know that they're making assumptions as they write the proposal. And if you just reply to the proposal with, well, here's the price I would charge, you're making a lot of assumptions, and they're making assumptions about you. And when both sides are making assumptions about the other side, that's when we start to doubt how collaborative the other side is going to be and the intentions of the other side. And, to Bob's point, if you want to have those, if you want to be, think of the other side as someone you want to have a relationship with and trust the other side, you have to be open with each other about what your intentions are and what you want. And again, asking those questions is a great way of overcoming those assumptions to really understand where each side is coming from and how they're thinking about and what they're focusing on. And if you've done all that process, and there's a term in negotiation called the BATNA, the BATA, or the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. You might hear that phrase thrown around as you start reading more into negotiation. Your BATNA is essentially what you could get from walking away. If you have a collaborative agreement and you are negotiating in good faith and you are really exploring and trying to create that relationship, it's much easier to walk away because you can always say, well, look, I think we're at an impasse where we've aligned on most of what we need to agree on, but your time frame and my time frame just don't align this time. But I would love to work with you again in the future, and I hope that we have the opportunity to do so, because I think there's a lot of great possibility here in terms of the value that I bring from brand creativity and design graphics, and your need to actually reach out to consumers and stand out from competitors. So let's keep in touch, because I would love to work with you in the future. That's a great way of ending a conversation. If it's just about whether you get, it's $3,000 or $4,000, if you disagree and say, well, I need $4,000, and they say, we only have a budget of $3,000, there's no way to say, okay, well, then we can't work together, but I really hope to work with you again in the future because of what the price works. I mean, when it's just focused on price, there's nothing to build on. And so if you've been building that relationship in the conversation, and if you've been exploring ways in which you are jointly going to be able to help each other, then saying this time it didn't work, but I would love to work with you in the future, would be a great way of ending that conversation or ending that specific negotiation, but still setting up I'm sorry it didn't work out this time. I look forward to the opportunity of working with you again in the future. So please keep me in mind, as you have other projects that you would need help with.
Yeah, that's a great point. Hey, John, you reminded me of something that we did talk about a little bit. And folks, I mean, this is one that I in my own business life, I would cringe when one of my own people would try to do this, and it almost never works. Never is a long time, but in all caps, never. And I really do mean never. Say that you're going to walk away, that you're stepping away. This is my last offer, my best and final offer, whatever the terms you want to use. Never say that and not mean it. Mm-hmm. Because once you launch that grenade, you're done. And you're done one of two ways. You're done, either you're out of there, you move on to the next project, or if you go, crap, I need that deal, and you go back hat in hand, you've blown all of those things we've talked about up to this point. And you start out with limited or no trust between you and your client because you just weren't credible in what you said. John described a number of ways to manage and deal with a conflict, a disagreement. We're just not going to quite get there in respectful and in terms that leave a door open for the future somehow. And that's really critical as you get to that point. Along those lines, and as we wind down and maybe get ready to take some questions a bit, I think to me, it was always important, once you think you're getting close to an agreement, you think you've got most of the key things worked out, and you kind of know what the scope is, the timeframes, the budget that you're working with, the deliverables. I've always found it useful to write them down. And I don't mean get a lawyer and write a contract. Just bullet points, write them down. And then sit down with your client or talk to them and just say, hey, I really want to go through this and make sure that we are truly aligned, that we're all, what I wrote down, you're reading it the same way that I mean to say it, and that we are aligned. And then at that point, maybe pen to paper if you need to do a contract, or maybe that's sufficient for the scope of work and it just goes on a purchase order. But it's really good to write those kinds of things down. And just the fact that, going back to, we all have our own filter systems in that. I remember the first large business that I was asked to take on, it was struggling. And I did a lot of work with turnarounds in my career. And sitting down with the leadership team for that business, and it was about a dozen people, and we were in Frankfurt, Germany. And as an exercise, I said, do me a favor. Just write down what you believe the vision is for this business today, before I'm coming in as the president of the business. And what do you feel like the most important 2 or 3 things that you do extremely well are? And what are the things that we really need to improve on to get this on the right path? And about a dozen people in the room, and we probably had 7 or 8 different answers. And just that exercise of writing down what what people had on their minds on those subjects helped. So it's the same, I think, with clients when you're negotiating. When you get to the point where you feel like you got a pretty good understanding of where you're headed, just to jot that down and test it, it really helps in so many different ways.
And, and I would encourage you actually to do that after every conversation. Not the full detail of what the arrangement looks like, but thanks for meeting with me last Tuesday or yesterday. I came away with the understanding that you're looking for a 3-week project. You want to have this deliverable. It's going to happen in these months. You're looking for, et cetera. What you talked about, and sort of if there were any sort of interim agreements or alignment, list out what those are. Because to Bob's point, if the other side gets that email and reads it and says, that's not what we talked about, you'd rather know now than you would the next time you talk. You'd rather have them be able to push back and say, no, actually, we need something in 2 weeks' time, not 3 weeks' time. Everyone's going to enter a negotiation. They're going to focus on different things because that's what their brain is. When you put it down on paper, it refocuses everyone to the words that are on the piece of paper or on the computer screen as they're reading it. And so it's not about detailing the full text of what you agreed to at each session, but has some high levels. And then, end it with, I look forward to I'm talking next Tuesday, where we can talk about price and some of the other, terms that we need to align on. Again, putting it out there in writing so that the other side can respond to it. Now, if they come back and say, that's not what I agreed to, I wanted this in, 2 weeks instead of going back and forth by email saying, okay, well, let's talk about that when we meet next. I thought we had agreed on the time frame, but let's re-talk, let's discuss that again when we meet next time. So it's not about having a negotiation over email, unless that's what the client wants, but it's about, here's what I heard coming out of our last meeting. Here's the next step we're going to talk about next time. I look forward to talking. And not saying, do you agree? Just saying, here's my report back to you. And that gives them the opportunity to write back, say, yep, sounds great. See you next Tuesday. Or actually, that's not the timeline, or that's not the pricing mechanism, or that's not the whatever. And then just say, okay, well, let's talk about that next time. And again, that leaves it open to them to say, no, we need to figure this out before we meet. Okay, well, let's go back and forth over email. But putting it in writing, again, not making assumptions. If you don't put it in writing, you're making an assumption that the other side agrees with you. Putting it in writing lays out what all those assumptions are, so you're not going to get into disagreement down the road.
Yeah, I think, John, you've helped bring the conversation, so to speak, full circle. And guys, it is about those conversations. It's about the experiences you've already had in your lives. The first 18 or 20 or whatever years of your life, you've been practicing negotiation all along the way. Here's hopefully some thinking, some techniques, some approaches that are foundational. Clearly, there's a lot more technical detail that you'll get into as you grow and develop. But absolutely, it is a conversation. It's collaborative. It's finding a way that makes sense for both you and your client. And as John described so well, sometimes it's not going to work. It's okay. Just be thankful, be respectful, and move on. Hey, how about questions? I guess, Nicole, at this point, would it make sense?
That would be great. And I would invite people to either just call out your question or put it in the chat and we can field them. I think we've got about maybe five minutes for some questions.
Bob, you sort of mentioned that one of the things you would always, that would kind of, worry you is when people said, yeah, this is my final offer, I'm walking away. And both of you sort of mentioned that, we all are sort of bringing really valuable skill sets and experience to our work with clients. But do you have any recommendation for how you sort of negotiate if you feel like, you don't have a lot of negotiating power there, that you're competing with 10 other people who are very similar, and maybe they're all going to sort of, be able to outbid you or something like that. If you don't feel like you have, if you feel like the other side has a lot of power, what recourse do you have?
I think that's a great question because it is really important. So everything we talked about this morning is about really understanding the client's point of view, their approach, the culture in their company, things that are important. And if you have that, I've found often that many companies, if you're competing for a business or a project or whatever it is, they don't do the same level of homework. There's many negotiations where we would go in and feel like we had no leverage, or we had no ability, if you would, to turn the screw and to make sure that we got what we needed. And to me, setting all that aside is an important first step. The second is, as you do the analysis with your client or customer, make sure you're checking out your competition. You know what they're capable of. And we always try to avoid comparing ourselves to the competition because we don't know what we don't know. And throwing rocks to me never helped. And focus on your values, what you bring to the game, how you would differentiate this, make it better for the client with your capabilities, your resources, your knowledge. And if it doesn't work, as John said, it doesn't work. And you thank them and you move on. There will come times, however, when you are in a negotiation where you can't afford it. You just can't go beyond that. And at that point, and doing it respectfully, it's okay to say, guys, this is the best I can do. If we want to restructure the approach or do it in stages or come up with different options that could maybe meet your need, we can do that. Otherwise, it's probably best for us to back off on this one. And we'd love the opportunity to work with you again.
Yeah, I would say the types of situations where there is no negotiation per se, meaning that the client says, here's our proposal, here's what we're looking for, please reply by next Thursday, and then we will make our choice. That's not a negotiation. That's, you don't really have any power, you don't have any ability, you just submit and you hope for the best. But if it's actually a negotiation where you're talking with the client, then the best ways I think to stand out are to show that you are adding value to the client. I always say this to students that come and ask me about, how should I interview? How do I stand out as an interviewee when I'm interviewing? And I say, well, think about it from the position. Again, this goes back to what Bob and I keep saying. Think about it from the other side's position. If you're the interviewer and you have 10 different people you've talked to, and at the end of the day, the recruiting office says, okay, so who is, you talked to Brett earlier. What was Brett like? And you're, oh, Brett, that was me. Brett, yeah. Brett, let me look at the resume. What did Brett say? Yeah, Brett seems, smart, good. As opposed to who talked to Sally? Sally, yeah, Sally, really interesting. She asked me all kinds of. She was asking me really about all the work that we're doing in the nonprofit space, and I was really having a hard time answering her because she was asking really deep questions. And I think we should put her in touch with the people who do the nonprofit work at our organization because they would probably have a better. Who's going to stand out? Like the person that actually is asking questions and showing interest and trying to problem solve and actually engaging with the person. Just the same thing with a negotiation. If there are 10 other people that have the same background, same skills, same portfolio, same everything as you, and they just submit a written proposal, but you're saying, hey, I actually have a few questions about what you put out. Would you have 15, 20 minutes so I could ask them to you? If the other side says yes, and you go and you say, this is really great, and ask your questions, which are open the mind, probing questions, collaborative, trying to solve problems, create value, etc., that's going to stand out in and of itself. And as long as your price is competitive with the other side, if you have all those extra things, when it comes down to 9 people that look exactly the same, plus you, which add all these other cool, interesting ways of looking at the world, you're, again, as a client, I would lean on that one. It's like, I'm going to be better willing to make the bet that person is going to be able to deliver because of how they've delivered in the negotiation itself. Like I said, the process of the negotiation is already signaling what it's going to be like to work with you. It's not just a standalone activity. So if you go into it thinking about how can I actually be collaborative and show that I create value and inquisitive about the other side and show that I can do all these things when I have it, that's part of the value that you're bringing to the proposal or your pitch to the other side.
And I think, John, you put those in the context of what you've learned about your client and the company. What is it they're trying to accomplish? What's their strategy? What is it that they have in terms of constraints? Or what are the options that they're willing to consider? So many companies in negotiating don't do a very good job of that. And it's a great opportunity. It was a great question. It's a great opportunity for you to differentiate yourself without just a list of things that you can do that don't connect to the reality of what that client is trying to accomplish.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, but many thanks to John and Bob for that great conversation.